Welcome to the Liberating Joy in Learning podcast. I'm Robert Becksham, and today we're going to begin our discussion of the sixth primary lens, working with resistance. Now, so often when we think of learning, our first thoughts are about self-discipline. Before we can be effective with that, however, we need to understand the role of the previous 5 primary lenses in our learning. Author and educator John Holt says, "How much people can learn at any moment depends on how they feel at that moment about the task and their ability to do the task. When we feel powerful and competent, we leap at difficult tasks." Now, as we've learned so far, there is so much more to learning than the emotionally challenging effort to work with resistance. Much of the purpose for the previous lenses is to pave the way and prepare us for the effort we choose with this primary lens. Specifically, in the previous lens, tuning into learning seasons, that helps us figure out what actions won't help us with learning claims, consequently reducing frustrations in our learning. With this sixth lens, working with resistance, we recognize the struggles that don't go away. Then we move to act using resistance to help us grow. So that explanation, the first question to ask is, and this is kind of counterintuitive, but when has self-discipline prevented growth? Okay, I'm asking of you first.
I know,
have
I'm just pausing for effect. There
okay.
We go, right? So I take notes ahead of time to answer some of these questions.
Right.
And the first one I wrote down was playing the piano.
Okay.
Practicing is just not always effective.
Right.
Right. And there's kind of a limit to what we can do on our own. And there's
Right.
a lot of things that can resolve that. But certainly, self-discipline is not always the best way to improve at a skill.
Self-discipline itself is not always the effective way to grow.
Right.
Because learning to play the piano is a perfect example. What we're talking about here is the quote from John Holt is how we feel at that moment.
Right.
Because you may have all the self-discipline in the world to be practicing, but if you hate what you're doing, you're not going to grow.
No, you won't. And just doing stuff is not growing. Like we've kind of made that point, right?
Right.
And so it's the same thing. Let's take it a step further. Just forcing yourself to do something is not growing.
Exactly.
Right?
Right. All right, so that goes into the next question. How does working with resistance help us grow? And I think we've kind of answered that as we've been discussing this, that once we realize the struggles that we have to overcome to grow, and we realize that is when we were talking when our kids were younger, we have to slay the dragon, climb the mountain or get whatever. There are struggles that we have to overcome, that you can't eliminate resistance completely from learning.
Right.
And once we recognize that and we have the right attitude of like, I'm going to get over that. I mean, that hike we did when we went to the Valley of Fire, climbing up,
it was warm and the kids didn't want to do it, but we made it into a challenge.
Right, made it a challenge to conquer the mountain, slay the dragon, get to the top. And that was a growing experience because we recognized what that resistance was, what that struggle was, and we overcame it and helped them overcome it.
Right, and they knew there was purpose, right? We were going to a destination, and there was purpose into it. So, I'm going to go back to the fact, just doing stuff is not growing.
Right.
But when you know what you're doing, when you have purpose in all of the other primary lenses that have come before this, then doing stuff is learning.
Right.
Right? When you know which plant you want to pull out, that was from my notes, I wrote down weeds, right? When I know what plant I want to pull out, then my garden will progress and grow.
Right.
So there's that. But just recognizing those actions that we really need to grow.
Right.
That's when resistance really helps you grow.
Right.
If you take off in the desert and you just take off, you're going to die.
Right.
It's not going to help you grow. You're going to die. Same thing. If you don't have the right actions, if you don't have the self-discipline for the right actions, then you're not progressing.
Right.
As mentioned earlier, working with resistance looks a lot like self-discipline, requiring lots of energy in order to choose and make difficult actions. Once we have done the work with previous primary lenses and have chosen to work with resistance, however, that action gives us power. Author and mentor Kathy Lawman explains that our true source of power comes when we are in action. I thought about writing her book, a great deal, but it didn't create energy or become a reality until I began putting words on the paper, close quote. Intentional work and action create power.
Right.
So, what actions in learning have given you more power in your learning?
Well, it gets back to that intentional work. Again, not just doing something to be doing something.
Right.
Having a purpose, having a desire to, and then not just thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the example that I go back to is when I was learning to play the cello when I was in the 6th grade. That it kind of can be equated to learning to play the piano. I did not like learning to play the piano, but I loved learning to play the cello. So
Right.
I had that desire to grow, and so I put that desire into action, and I practiced it, and I did my practice, and I learned, and I grew on that.
Right.
I grew in that skill. So that's an example that I go back to.
For me, I thought of journaling. So if
Okay.
I don't know what to do next, like with this book or really in life, I have an exercise where once a week I just force myself to write 600 words. So for me, journaling is putting thoughts into words that I'm willing to type
Okay.
because I hate handwriting.
Right.
But I love putting that into words. So if
Right.
I don't know what to do next with Learning Liberated, then I just sit myself down and I have a place where I journal.
Right.
And I just ramble about anything that comes to my mind in relation to this.
Right.
And that action gives me power, it gives me ideas, it gets the juices flowing.
Right.
So it's that action that's so important.
Okay. Working with resistance is not just about choosing an independent action. It is also about choosing a communal action or an action that interacts with the people and world around us. An example is while learning to play the piano, we might teach our fingers to interact with directions in the music and the resistance of the instrument, giving life to written musical notes by moving our fingers again and again according to the music and in response to the keys on the keyboard until we match the music. And I would say learning to play the cello
Right.
is
Cello.
the same
Yes.
concept.
Yes.
Orchestra concerts offer other opportunities to work with resistance, learning to create harmoniously with others. This brings the music and all our preparations to life. And that's very important, is learning to work with other people is a way to overcome resistance. Work
Right.
with resistance, not to overcome it.
Right. So you work with resistance of the object that you're playing the music on.
Right.
But then you also work with the resistance of people around you.
Right.
To play together, to play harmoniously, to
Right.
all of those aspects of working together,
Right.
working that with, and there it's a form of a resistance.
Right.
With
Because that also helps you develop and hone that skill
yes.
that you're learning. Learning to play the piano or the cello or the guitar or whatever, in this analogy of musical instruments, doing it by yourself can only go so far.
Right.
And until you go out and you interact with other people in some form, you can't get to that next level.
Yeah. Even if it's they don't like this music, so
Right.
I'm going to play something else.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. A visual way to understand working with resistance is to look at the spiral. For Michael Schneider, an author we've mentioned before, the growth transformation that spirals signify comes from resistance, and they occur in response to the world's resistance. When working with resistance, we act with and against the resistance of the world around us. The inspiration of the previous primary lenses keeps us motivated and progressing. Working with resistance from outside of us becomes a continuous process of transformation and recreation of ourselves. And just to kind of describe that, like if something is growing in a spiral, it responds to the world around it even as it progresses, right? And it curls in on itself.
Right.
And that's kind of where that concept comes from. Schneider explains that the world resembles a whirlpool of transformation, which we can cooperate with for our benefit. Working with resistance is our process of acting with an outer world filled with a multitude of other processes also in action. Swiss mathematician Jacob Bernoulli gave the spiral a motto: although changed, I arise again the same. Life exists when we interact with our communities in ways that change us and the world around us, while we also keep a firm hold of our inner self.
Right.
How does interacting with the world around you influence your learning efforts?
Well, I think it helps. You take that example of the spiral, and it kind of subtly Bernoulli kind of subtly says that although change, I arise. No, I guess.
Yeah, that's it.
I arise again the same. But life exists when we interact with our community. So you said something about. There we keep a firm hold of our inner self. If you think about a spiral, it's got a center point.
Yeah.
That it rotates around. That's its center. That's its anchor. And so when we're working with resistance, we have our learning goal, what we want to learn. That's our anchor. And as we interact with the world, it may help us go in a different direction than we thought we were ever going to go.
Right.
But by using that resistance to keep growing, then we will keep growing. We will keep improving ourselves.
Right. And really, anytime you interact with people, you're working with resistance,
Right.
because they have different experiences. Even if you have
Right.
similar goals, they still have experiences
Right.
that are different from yours. And it helps us,
Right.
refine what we're doing and adjust.
Right. It's a different point of view, different way of looking at the world,
Right.
and so that helps you. As long as you're working with it, not against it, you're able to grow and develop.
Yeah. Well, when we play disc golf, right? When we actually
Right.
throw the disc, then there's a whole bunch of factors. The wind clearly is a big
Right.
factor, and the type of terrain that we're stepping on,
Right.
how that affects terrain that's in front of us. Sometimes there's a tree overhanging things,
Right.
and that affects kind of how we react and how we
Right.
throw. So, there's so much when you actually decide to act, there's a lot of things that influence that.
Right.
And this is where we get to think about those things.
Right.
So there's a lot more to working with resistance than just using self-discipline to act. It's an opportunity to find new sources of power and reinvent ourselves by applying our learning to the environment we live in. Next time, we'll explore the benefits of this primary lens even more so that we can further dispel our aversions to this part of learning that requires self-discipline. In the meantime, send any questions or comments to learningliberated@gmail.com or share with us in our Learning Liberated Facebook group. And if this episode spoke with you, share it with someone else.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.